Okay, Boker Tov, everybody. For the seventh and last class in this series by Rabbi Chwat, I want to thank him for this wonderful series, very insightful series. I was just telling my brother who lives in Israel that we're doing a 7-part series on religious Zionism, and yet, very much staying on the focus on the issues, sort of the intellectual issues as opposed to the political, issues, which I think is much nicer. And today, I think we're going to be discussing, can Israel be a false Messiah? And that itself, the title is quite, I guess, a provocative title in a certain way. But let's hear what Rabbi Shvat has to say about that. B'vakasha.
Okay. They told me that it's always good to have a provocative title. That way more people come. Every Shabbat, in probably most of the shuls that most of us go to, we say Tfilah L'Shlom Hamdina, the prayer for the welfare of the state of Israel. And in there's a line, Barechet Medinat Yisrael Reshit Tzmichat Ge'ulatenu. We ask Hashem to bless the state of Israel, which is the beginning of the flourishing of our redemption. And there's a famous story. I actually wrote an article about it to try and document it. I found 5 different cases regarding Rav Herzog. Rav Yitzchak Herzog, who was the Ashkenazic chief rabbi after Rav Kook in the early 1940s, when Field Marshal Rommel, Yamach Shmo, from the German army, had already conquered a considerable amount of North Africa, and he was on his way to conquer Eretz Yisrael. And Rav Herzog was in the United States. According to one account, he was visiting with Mayor LaGuardia, who, by the way, was Jewish. His mother was Jewish. His mother tongue was Yiddish. And according to another account, it was President Roosevelt. According to a third account, it was Rabbi Eliezer Silver. According to a fourth account, it was a bunch of rabbis from the OU, I believe, or the RCA. Anyway, the odds are that this is the type of story that happened several times. But according to the story, they told Rav Herzog when he was in the States that maybe he should stay in America to see whether Germany would get to Palestine to conquer the land, because it would not be good for Jews. To which Rabbi Herzog answered that Davka, the shepherd, should be with his sheep when they are in danger, so he has to go back. To which his hosts replied, but if Germany makes it to the land of Israel, you're not going to have any sheep. To which Rav Herzog answered, don't worry, Rommel is not going to make it to the land of Israel. And his host said to him, how do you know? And Rav Herzog said, we Jews have a Jewish tradition that we were sent to exile 3 times, to Egypt, to Babylon, and then to Rome in the destruction of the Second Temple. And once we come back, there's not going to be another exile. And the question is, really, could there be another exile? We know from Jewish history that false messiahs are terrible fiascos. The most famous was Shabtai Tzvi, but David HaReuveni, Shlomo Molcho. And every time the Jews get their hopes up and there's a false messiah, it is a terrible spiritual downfall. And a lot of people lose their faith. And in all honesty, the vast majority of the rabbis never fell for these false messiahs. Some went with Shabtai Tzvi. But obviously, it is not wise to say that the state of Israel is part of the redemption Geula process if we're not 100% sure. And in fact, at the beginning of religious Zionism, Rav Yaakov Reines, he did allude here and there to messianic overtones. There's a famous quote that every beat of the hammer in Eretz Yisrael hastens the redemption. On the other hand, Rabbi Reines, when the idea of Uganda came up, He said the most important thing is to find a safe haven for the Jews, even if it's not going to be in the land of Israel. And Rav Soloveitchik also famously did not enjoy the term, calling the state of Israel definitively that it is the beginning of the redemption. Let's get into the sources because we don't have too much time. I brought for you a quote from Rav Soloveitchik in source Aleph, where he writes as follows: Yeshna deya hilchatit shlishit. He says, very often in Judaism, there are three opinions. There is the more machmir, strict opinion. There is the more lenient opinion. And then there is the middle of the road opinion. And he says the same thing regarding Zionism. He says, what is the third opinion? She'inna makbila lo lidat stumei ha'ayin ha'sholalim. That for sure the Satmar Hasidim, who totally degrade the state of Israel as Maseh Satan, as the works of Satan, but also this middle opinion is not totally obligate the total optimism of the state of Israel. So much so, this is the opinion of Rav Kook, that sees the state of Israel as an important historic and meta-historic event in Jewish history. As opposed to them, says Rav Soloveitchik, he says that the general rule of the Rambam is to follow the middle opinion. He says, I allow myself to guess on this particular issue of how to relate to the state of Israel. We'll see the good in the state of Israel. We'll see that it's something good, something that should be celebrated on Yom Ha'atzmaut, for example. V'tokir tkumata, and to hold dear its founding. Vatmadata, and its continuation. Mitochi ba vitmakrut, and to be actually, hitmakrut literally means to be addicted, which is a very strong term. Yes, we are addicted to supporting the state of Israel. Avalot tafriza ala racha yoter midai ad kedei glorificatia ve'ha'alaha. He says, nevertheless, I will not go to such an extent as to glorify and say the state of Israel is godly. On the other hand, Rav Kook in many places, especially after the Balfour Declaration, said in very clear terms, this is it. In source bet from one of the letters of Rav Kook, Ken atchalta de geula vadai olechet umofia lefanenu. Yes, the beginning of redemption is clearly advancing and appearing before us. In Safek, there is no doubt that this great movement is part of the redemption process. His student, Rav Karlap, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Merkaz Harav afterwards, in a quote in Sefer Mimaynei HaYeshua, at the end of source Bet, he says, Hadavar barur kashemesh batzohorayim. It is as clear as the sun during the afternoon. Shechurban shlishi lo ye'od. That there will not be another exile. There will not be a third destruction of this third commonwealth. Umdinat Yisrael shekama letchiyah bal timot le'olam va'ed. That the state of Israel is here to stay. And no, it's not a false Messiah, and there cannot be another exile. Now, regarding those like Rav Moshe Feinstein, like Rav Soloveitchik, who said, I don't know, maybe it is part of the Geulah process, that's just playing it safe. You don't really need a source to say maybe. Yeah, the Jews are returning to the land of Israel. Yeah, Baruch Hashem, we have a lot to thank God for. Is it part of the Geulah process? A lot of rabbis just say maybe. On the other hand, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, Professor Zalman Meltzer, went in the direction of Rav Kook, and even though it sounds like they're going out on a limb and taking a gamble. Apparently, they were all 100% sure that this is the Geula process. Now, it's important to point out Yemot HaMashiach, the term Yemot HaMashiach means the days of Mashiach. And Chazal and the Rambam don't talk so much about one day where the Beit HaMikdash is going to come crashing down and Mashiach is going to come and all the Jews are going to come in gathering from all four corners of the earth. But Yemot HaMashiach is a process. We don't know how long it's going to take. It could take 70 years, for example, since the founding of the State of Israel. It's been more than 100 years since the Balfour Declaration. It could take 200, 300 years. But the question that we're going to deal with today is the state of Israel and is the return to Zion that we see over the last century, is this part of the Messianic process? And again, the burden of proof is on Rav Kook. By the way, Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik's younger brother, he used to use the term from the Talmud Yerushalmi, Ayelet HaShachar, that before Amud HaShachar, before the morning star, before the break of dawn, is the morning star. And so he did use messianic terms. Again, Rav Soloveitchik himself, just like Rav Reines, sometimes does use messianic terms. Most famously, Kol Dodi Dofek, which is obviously an answer to the Satmar Rebbe. By the way, it's important to point, because from my experience, a lot of people don't realize when the Satmar Rebbe instituted the Gemara from Masechet Ketuvot, Daf Kuf Yud, that says that there were 3 oaths that Israel swore on the way to exile. 3, 6, we'll take the shortest version, that we swore that we will not rebel against the nations of the world and that we will not go en masse to the land of Israel. And the Goyim swore that they would not oppress the Jews too much in exile. And the Satmar Rebbe agrees, based on that pasuk in Shir HaShirim, says, Hare, what is Shir HaShirim about? Just the storyline. There's so much poetry there. Most people don't follow the story. The basic story regarding this chapter is that we have the Dod and the Ra'aya, the beloved and the beloved, the man and the woman. By the way, Rav Yaakov Meidan says, why is he called the Dod, which also means uncle? He says that the classic shidduch that used to be made in the olden days was between the youngest brother of the father, who was the uncle of the Kala. And that's why he calls it a Dod. That's just one explanation. But they're madly in love with each other. And one time in the middle of the night, the boyfriend comes to the girlfriend and knocks on the door and says, I must see you. And she says, I'm already in pajamas. I've already washed my feet. I'm already in bed. Come back tomorrow. And he says, no, I'm burning with love for you. I must see you. And he's knocking on the door. And she, in the end, is overcome with desire. She runs to open the door, and her boyfriend has left. And then she runs out to the streets of Yerushalayim, looking for her boyfriend, asking, have you seen him? Have you seen him? And then she gives up hope. And eventually, she makes the daughters of Jerusalem swear that I don't want to hear his name anymore. I make you swear that you won't mention his name until it's time. The Satmar Rebbe says, what does it mean until it's time? Till the Mashiach comes. Most of Chazal explain it differently. That's not our topic for today. But the Rav Soloveitchik says that when is it time to return to the land of Israel? When our beloved starts knocking on the door. And there are definitely, just like the Satmar Rebbe had anti-messianic tones, Rav Soloveitchik in that article does have certain messianic tones. Nevertheless, there is the possibility that if we don't answer and open the door, we can blow it. And We don't want to miss this opportunity. Rav Kook does not go in that direction. Rav Kook says, yes, the process can go like this, or it can go like this. It can go quicker, or it can go slower. There are definitely ups and downs along the road. But the question is, again, the burden of proof is on Rav Kook, on Rav Herzog, on Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. How can they say so emphatically, this is the redemptive process? There are 3 points that are cited. Let's start with the Gemara on Masechet Sanhedrin, source number 5, which Chazal call the Ketz HaMiguleh, the clearest sign. Our topic is we want to know what is the clearest sign. Even the Satmar Rebbe wants to know what is the clearest sign. How do you know that it's time to return? And the Gemara Masechet Sanhedrin, in a famous machlok between Rebbe Eliezer and Rebbe Yoshua, comes to a maskana that there is a case, there is a deadline that even if Am Yisrael does not do tshuva, does not do repentance by that certain deadline, God is going to redeem us even if we don't deserve it. Why? Well, we say 3 times a day. Umevi goel livnei bneihem lema'an shmo be'ahava. 3 points. Hashem is going to redeem us for the sake of our forefathers, because he promised to Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov that we are his people forever, and the land of Israel is given to us forever. That's livnei bneihem lema'an shmo, is because exile is a terrible chilul Hashem. We spoke about this once, right? The worst defiling of God's name was in the Holocaust, when even a lot of Jews started believing the goyim who asked, Jew, where's your God? That's lema'an shmo. Exile is a bad reflection on God. And the third reason, be'ahava. A father simply loves his children and he wants us to be with him. So even if we don't deserve it, God is going to bring us back at the case, at the time. What is the time? So the Gemara Masechet Sanhedrin says as follows: Va'amar Rabbi Abba, ein lecha ketz miguleh mizeh. There is no clearer sign than this. Before we see what the clearest sign is, the Gemara is inferring that there are unclear signs. We all know, anyone who's learned the V'im Achronim, Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel, that there are a lot of unclear signs. For example, Yirmiyahu, Zechariah, Yechezkel talk about that there are going to be big wars before the coming of the redemption. So, World War I, which was such a big war, a lot of people said, oh, this must be it. And afterwards came the Balfour Declaration. Oh, but then came World War II, which was even bigger. And Am Yisrael, Jewish people, were in the middle of World War II. So they said, okay, this must be it. And then the War of Independence in 1948 came. And people looked back in Zechariah and in Yechezkel, and they said, hey, World War I, World War II could not have been Milchama Gog uMagog, because Milchama Gog uMagog refers to after Am Yisrael is back in the land of Israel, they're going to want to gang up and take away the land. That's the War of Independence. And then came the 6-Day War, where a similar scenario came along, but this time it was a super miraculous victory. And people said, okay, this must be Milchemet Gog uMagog. Anyway, all of these different guesses proves that it's unclear what type of war is going to be the war which precedes the Geulah, the redemption. The same thing as Zechariah talks about a great earthquake. Yirmiyahu talks about a terrible Holocaust, which comes right before the redemption. Now, I'm not going to say that the Holocaust that was during World War II was the Holocaust that is going to precede redemption, simply because every time there was a false Messiah, when people asked, what is your proof that you are the Messiah? He would say, look at this terrible pogrom that just happened. So they said the Crusades, that must have been the terrible pogrom, so I must be the Messiah. And Gzerot Tachvetat and Bogdan Khmelnytsky, and before Shabtai Tzvi, there were so many terrible pogroms that everybody could point out and say, No, this is the Holocaust that precedes the redemption. And it can't get any worse. But anybody who learned Jewish history knows that, yes, it could always get worse. And that's why we're not going to talk about the Holocaust, because that's an unclear sign. Earthquakes, those are unclear signs. So if so, what is the clearest sign? Chazal tell us, again, in Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Tzadichet Amud Aleph, source number 5. What is the clearest sign? The Gemara brings the pasuk, Shene'emar Yechezkel Lamed Vav Pasuk Ched Ve'atem Harei Yisrael. You mountains of Israel, Anpechem Titenu, grow your branches, Ufer Yechem Tisu, carry your fruit, La'ami Yisrael Ki Kirvu Lavo, because my nation of Israel is about to return. In other words, when the land of Israel begins growing fruit, flourishing, that is the clearest sign that Am Yisrael is about to return. Rashi explains, Kishititain Eretz Yisrael Pirya Ba'ayin Yafa Az Yikarev HaKetz. When the land of Israel gives her fruit abundantly, that is how you know that Ototo, the Geula, is coming. Again, we're not talking about the Mashiach coming in one day. We're talking about a process. But how do you know you're going to be in the process? When the land of Israel returns to give fruit. Now, the obvious question is, what's such a big deal about the land of Israel giving fruit? All countries give fruit. The land of Israel, we know historically, was a land of milk and honey, a land of Eretz Chita, Sora, Gefen, Tena, Verimon. It's a land which was always fruitful. Archaeologists know by looking at date pits, olive pits, that the land of Israel was super fruitful. We even learned in 10th grade history. Do you remember the Fertile Crescent? Here I have a picture. I don't know. Yeah, can you see it? The Fertile Crescent, which, remember 10th grade, Mesopotamia was the cradle of civilization. They still teach that, by the way, to all the 18-year-olds. And the mitochondria is still the powerhouse of the cell. And some things never change. The Fertile Crescent goes from Babylon through Ashur and Persia and includes the land of Israel. The land of Israel was part of the Fertile Crescent because it was very fertile. But what happens? The Torah tells us in the Tochecha that if Am Yisrael, if we do not listen, follow the Torah and mitzvot, God is going to give us a couple of warnings. And eventually, if we continue serving idols, he is going to exile us from the land, and the land is going to become barren. Until when? Until we are about to return. And that is what the Ramban says in source number 6 on the Tochecha. Let's see it inside. Source number 6. On Vayikra Perek Kavav, V'chein ma she'amar, V'chein ma she'amar bekan v'shamamu alea oivechem. Right? The pasuk says, "Vashimoti ani et haaretz." God says, "I will make the land deserted, desert." He besorah tova. The Raman says, "This is good news." How is this good news? Mivaseret b'chol galuyot, teaching us that throughout all the exiles, she'ein artzenu mikabelet et oivenu, that our land, like a faithful wife, will not give herself over to our enemies. This is a great proof and promise to the Jewish people. We also learned in world history in 10th grade that where will countries be established? Where will you have governments? Well, where will you have kingdoms? You need 4 factors. You need good land, you need water, you need defensible borders, and you need travel ways. Now, a location which has all 4 was inhabited 3,000 years ago, was inhabited 2,000 years ago, was inhabited 1,000 years ago, will always be inhabited because that is a place which is ideal for setting up a kingdom, except for the land of Israel. Ki me'az yatzanu mimenu, from the time that Israel was exiled, lo kibla umav. She did not accept any other nation. Everyone is trying to settle the land. Who is everyone? We're talking about the Christians and the Crusades. We're talking about the Muslims, and then the Christians, and then the Muslims again. And why do they want the land of Israel? First of all, it's the Holy Land. Second of all, geographically, it was seen as the center of the ancient world, right? We all remember the flower map before Columbus, that they used to draw the map of the world, that there was Europe, Africa, Asia, and in the middle, the Holy Land. So the Holy Land was seen as very centrally located. Historically, we know that it has very good land. Nevertheless, and it was very good, but as soon as the Jewish people were exiled, it became barren. I have pictures here. This is Tel Aviv at the beginning of the 20th century. This is the first group of families who came to Tel Aviv. All you can see, even if you can't make it out, is Yamin Usmol Rakhol Vachol. Sand. Anybody recognize this building? This is Kever Rahel. At the beginning of the 20th century, Kever Rahel was in the middle of nowhere. There were no buildings in Bethlehem. And when Mark Twain visited the land of Israel in 1867, by the way, it's important to stress, he is in a journey around the world. And it's called, his book is called Innocents Abroad. And this is somebody who traveled around the world. I have never been in the Sahara Desert. I haven't seen too much of the world, but this is somebody who's traveled around the world, and he's writing this 15 years before the first Aliyah. Keep in mind, the first Aliyah was in 1882. That was Baron Rothschild, Zichron Yaakov, Rishon LeZion. What was in the land of Israel 15 years before the first Aliyah? Mark Twain writes, "We traverse some miles of desolate country whose soil is rich enough." Interesting. He sees the soil is rich enough, but is given wholly to weeds. A silent, mournful expanse. A desolation is here that not even imagination can grace with the pomp of life and action. We reach Mount Tabor safely. We never saw a human being on the whole route. Some of you may know Har Tabor is in the Galilee, which is the greenest area of the country. 150 years ago, totally deserted. We press on toward the goal of our crusade, renowned Jerusalem. The further we went, the hotter the sun got, and the more rocky and bare, repulsive and dreary the landscape became. No landscape exists that is more tiresome to the eye than that which bounds the approaches to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is mournful, dreary, and lifeless. I would not desire to live here. It is a hopeless, dreary, heartbroken land. Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes, overbroods the spell of a curse that has withered its fields and fettered its energies. Palestine is desolate and unlovely, and why should it be otherwise? Can the curse of the deity, can the curse of God beautify a land? Palestine is no more of this world. It is sacred to poetry and tradition. It is a dreamland. So when the land of Israel today is blooming, I have a satellite picture of the land of Israel. Do you see where it's green? And you see where it's yellow and still deserted? It is like God drew a line. Where is the border of the state of Israel? Can you see it? And this is exactly what Chazal are telling us. And this is the Nevuah in Surah 7, Yechezkel Lamed Vav, that says, "V'aretz haneshama te'abed," we will work the land which was desolate. Tachar asher hayta shmama le'nei kol over. To summarize, we were told that there are going to be 3 stages. Stage number 1, the land of Israel was fruitful. We were told that if we sin, God is going to exile us, but the land is going to remain like a faithful wife and not give her fruit to anybody else. That also came true. And then we were told that the land of Israel is going to be revived and flourish only when Am Yisrael is about to return. And that has happened. And this is what Chazal call the clearest sign of redemption. And now you understand why when you buy a Jaffa orange, why is it so miraculous? Because for 2,000 years, the land was barren. Maybe I will just point out one last point. A friend of mine, David Ben Yosef, says that if you look at international literature, theater, movies, there's this classic storyline that repeats itself over and over in every language. There are two men fighting over the same woman, right? Remember Popeye and Bluto fighting over olive oil? And in certain places, they joust it out in their knights of shining armor. In other places, they have a sword fight to see who gets the girl. In other places, they have a fist fight. In the cowboys, they would have a duel. And if you're killed, you lose the girl. And if you're not killed, you get the girl. But in the modern world, it would be a good idea to ask the girl who she prefers. Nobody ever thought of that. And that would have saved a lot of fighting in the world. And the Arabs claim that the land of Israel is theirs. And we claim the land of Israel, she is ours. And why don't we just ask the land of Israel who she prefers? Because for 1,300 years, the Arabs were here, and the land, as you saw in the pictures and as you heard the description of Mark Twain, it was desolate, just like the Torah said it was going to be. When we come back, the land blooms just like Yechezkel says it is going to. So that's point number one, the clearest sign. What is the second stage of redemption? The Gemara in Masechet Megillah, in source number 4, Daf Yud Zayin Amud Bet, tells us that the Anshe Knesset Agdola, that the rabbis of the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, when they constructed the Shmona Esrei, the Amidah that we say to this day, from the 9th bracha on, it is arranged according to the order of redemption. What is the 9th bracha? Let's see it inside. Source number 4. Umar Ra'ul Omar Kibbutz Galuyot La'achar Birkat HaShanim. The 9th bracha is the bracha for rain in Eretz Yisrael, that the land of Israel should flourish. And then the rabbis placed the bracha of Tikah b'shofar gadol l'cherutenu v'sanes likabetz galuyotenu, asking God to return the exiles to the land of Israel. Why is that the next bracha? Dichtiv, and here Chazal bring the same source that we saw in Masechet Sanhedrin. Ve'atem arei Yisrael anpechem titenu feryechem tisu la'ami Yisrael ki kirvu lavo. Because when, after the mountains give her fruit, like we just saw, ki kirvu la'ami Yisrael ki kirvu lavo, because my nation of Israel is about to return. In other words, the second stage of redemption is the ingathering of the exiles. Now, I made a chart, a graph. I know that you can't see it very well. You can make it out a little. One of the advantages of a graph is that you could see visually that a certain phenomena is going on. I'll just give a personal example. My grandpa, Pidi Zichronah Livracha, my great-grandfather, who I knew, when he was born in 1880, there were 20,000 Jews in the land of Israel. For 1,900 years, there were always between 2,000 and 10,000 Jews in the land of Israel, basically static. Then all of a sudden, it doubled from 10,000 to 20,000. When my grandfather, Aaron Yaakov, was born in World War I, it already rose to 60,000. When my father was born, there were already 470,000 Jews in the land of Israel. When I was born, there were 1.9 million Jews in the land of Israel. When my son was born in the 1980s, there were 3.3 million Jews in the land of Israel. And when my grandson was born, there were 5.2 million Jews in the land of Israel. Today, there are 7 million Jews in the land of Israel. Now, if there's always between 2,000 and 10,000, and then all of a sudden the graph jumps, there is something going on. Now, historically, most of you are familiar with the first Aliyah that we mentioned before. Then came the second Aliyah, the socialist Aliyah. The third Aliyah, after the pogroms from Kishinev. The fourth Aliyah, the large Aliyah before the Holocaust. Large Aliyah after the Holocaust. After the founding of the State of Israel, the Sephardic Aliyah from Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Yemen. Afterwards, the largest Aliyah of them all, 1.2 million Jews from the former Soviet Union. And by the way, this is when I became a teenager and I started collecting newspaper clippings. I didn't know that there was going to be an internet and we wouldn't need newspapers anymore. But every time there was a massive Aliyah, I would save the newspaper clippings. And here you see in 1990, Mivtza Shlomo, the large Aliyah of Ethiopian Jews. And when I came to Israel, we didn't even know that there were Black Jews. And then all of a sudden, in 3 missions, we discovered 70,000 Ethiopian Jews. Then there was the war between Bosnia and Serbia, which I have to admit, I still don't know what it was about, but it brought the Aliyah of most of the remaining Jews of Yugoslavia. Afterwards, as a result, came the Aliyah of the rest of the Jews from Bulgaria. In the early 2000s, a huge Aliyah from South America began, which is still going on to this day. The Glasnost, 1989, was the major turning point where those tens of thousands from the Soviet Union turned into hundreds of thousands, 1.2 million. Today, where is the largest Aliyah from? France, where they're expecting 30,000 Olim from France a year. The highest rate of Aliyah of any Jewish community in the world is from Venezuela. And everyone's coming for a different reason, but the common denominator is that the Jewish people are coming home. And again, you could see in the graph that you can't deny that if the people of Israel are coming back from, I once saw this in the Jewish Agency, 102 different countries. There are Jews in Israel who have come from 102 different countries. That's pretty spread out. And that's exactly what the gathering of the exiles is about. Now, how do you know, okay, it's definitely a great aliyah, the largest aliyah in the last 2,000 years. But how do you know that this is the return to the land of Israel? Chazal tell us, let us see, the Midrash Tanchuma, 1,800 years ago, Chazal tell us in source number 8, on the pasuk in Zechariah, Perek Yud Gimel, pasuk Chet, Vashlishit yivater ba. It literally means in the third, we will remain in her. Referring to the third return to Israel, we will remain. There's not going to be another exile. And Chazal spell it out. She'en mityashvim be'artzam ela begeula shlishit. Notice, Chazal are wording it in the negative so that you could be 100% clear. We will not return to the land of Israel, but in the third redemption. Geula Rishona, the first redemption, so Geula Mitzrayim, that was from Egypt. Geula Shniya, that was with Ezra and Nehemiah, so Geulat Ezra, that was the second return. Hashlishit, the third return, Ein La Hefsek. That is forever. There is not going to be another exile. This is a Jewish tradition. Now the question is, okay, fine, there are 7 million Jews in the land of Israel, but how do I know that that's a return? We'll just look at these 3 returns. In the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, anybody remember how many Jews came on Aliyah in the time of the second Beit HaMikdash? You could check in Ezra, chapter
40,000.
42,360. 42,360. That is considered a return. So if 42,000 is considered the second return, so Kal Vachomer, how much more so today, is not 42,000, is not 420,000, it's not 4.2 million. We have more than 100 times as many Jews in Israel today than we did in the time of the second return. So if that's a return, how much more so that today is a return? Now, somebody could say, well, maybe in the final return, 42,000 would not be enough. And in fact, Chazal tell us that we have another Jewish tradition. Let us see the Yalkut Shimoni in source number 9. Chazal tell us in the Yalkut Shimoni, on the Pasuk in Hosea, Va'anta yam shama kimei neurea uchimei alota mi'eretz Mitzrayim. Hashem will answer us in the final redemption like he did in the days of our youth, in the first redemption. In other words, it's true. 42,000 will not be enough to be considered a return. Ma yitziatam mi'Mitzrayim b'shishim ribo, uchnisatam la'aretz b'shishim ribo. Just like in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu and Yehoshua, we came to Israel with 600,000. Kain limot HaMashiach b'shishim ribo. So too it will be in the days of Mashiach, that the magic number of return to the land of Israel is 600,000. Now, I checked up, and how many Jews were there in Israel in 1948 at the founding of the state of Israel? 650,000. So apparently we passed the magic number. On the other hand, if you want to play the devil's advocate, if you look, if we're learning it out from Yetziat Mitzrayim, from the Exodus from Egypt, all right, who was 600,000 when we left Egypt? It was 600,000 army-aged men. So today you can find everything on the internet. When did Israel pass number 600,000 army-aged men? In 1967, in the Six-Day War, 670,000 army-aged men participated. In other words, no matter how you look at it, we have returned to the land of Israel. And Chazal tell us explicitly, once we have returned, that's it. There's not going to be another exile. By the way, that doesn't mean that it's going to be smooth sailing. As we said, the way of evolution is the general direction is up with ups and downs on the way. We know that there is wars, we know that there is terrorism, and Chazal already spoke about that on the Pasuk Domed Dodi Litzvi, that the Geula is like a deer. A deer, if you ever seen a deer, you see it, and then you don't. And then you see it here, and then you don't. And then you see it here, and then you don't. And that is, Chazal told us that the Geula is not just going to be a rose garden. Nevertheless, our topic is, are we part of the redemption? How did Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rav Kook and Rav Herzog say so clearly that we are? Point number one, when the land of Israel flourishes, Chazal say that is the sign. Point number two, if you look in the Nevi'im, the most common sign is the next stage, when Am Yisrael is returned. And Chazal tell us, once we have returned for the third time, there's not going to be another exile. Are we here? Yes, we are here. And I guess that means there's not going to be another exile. Point number three is the state of Israel. The state of Israel, by the way, Shabtai Tzvi did not make the desert bloom. He did not gather the exiles. He did not have a state of Israel. None of the false messiahs did. And the Rambam tells us what is the clearest sign of Yemot HaMashiach. By the way, I have to tell a story. I was once speaking in a shul in New York. It was a very nice turnout. It was in the middle of the week. And I started by asking the people, there are about 300 people there. I asked them, how many of you people are thinking of making Aliyah? And out of the 300 people, there were just a couple who raised their hands. And I, who wanted to speak about the importance of living in Israel, was unpleasantly surprised. So the rabbi, the local rabbi, saved the situation. He said, Rabbi Shvat, don't worry. In Yemot HaMashiach, we're all going to make Aliyah. So I asked 300 people, I asked, how many of you, by a show of hands, really, in Yemot HaMashiach are going to make Aliyah? All 300 people raised their hands. And I said, wow. But what if I can convince you and prove to you that we are in Yemot HaMashiach? And that's when I learned with them the Rambam that we're going to see now. The Rambam tells us, obviously based on Chazal, Rambam doesn't invent anything. He's straight from Chazal. In source number 13, source number 13. Here, the Rambam tells us, it's a very famous Rambam, that we look forward to Yemot HaMashiach, where we will have quiet and we could sit and learn Torah. Ein ben olam hazeh, the end of source 13, there is no difference between this world, Rashi explains, Galut, Yemot HaMashiach. What's the difference between Galut and Yemot HaMashiach, Messianic era? Ela shibud malchuyot bilvad. But that we will no longer be subservient to the nations. Now, if you should think that it's talking about Davka Mashiach, the Rambam in source 14 says, very similarly, again, Bisman shetashuv, what is Yemot HaMashiach? Bisman shetashuv ha'memshala liYisrael, when the government will return to the people of Israel. Now, I saw somebody before who says, oh, all of these are hashkafic statements, and let's hear a halachic statement. Well, first of all, our topic is a hashkafic topic, so obviously the sources are from hashkafa. But there is here a very interesting halachic source. The Shulchan Aruch, I think I mentioned this in the first shiur, source 15. The Shulchan Aruch in Orach Chaim, Siman Tavkuf Samach Aleph, says, whoever sees the cities of Judea in their destruction, he recites the following pasuk: Arei kodshecha hayu midbar, your holy cities have become a desert. V'korea, and you tear your clothing as a sign of mourning. Now, obviously, a religious Jew wants to fulfill the Shulchan Aruch. Why didn't anybody here, when you go to Be'er Sheva or Alon Shvut or Ashdod, some people do Kriya when they go to Yerushalayim, to the Kotel, we'll talk about that. But whenever anybody comes to San Simon or Arnona or Talpiot, nobody does Kriya, not even the anti-Zionists. Why don't they do Kriya? The Mishnah Brura explains, and again, this is a halachic statement, source 16. Afilu yoshvin bahen Yisrael, even if there are many Jews living in the land of Israel, kevan shayishmaelim moshlim alea, as long as the Arabs are ruling over, mikri bechurbanan, it is considered Qurban. In other words, why don't, on what date doing Kriya? On Hey Iyar Afshin Chet. In 1948, since we have the state of Israel, we're no longer in Qurban. And that is a halachic statement that the definition of Qurban is if you don't have an independent Jewish state. And Rav Moshe Feinstein says regarding Har HaBayit, it's different. He says, many of you have heard that when you go to the Kotel or you go to the Temple Mount, you still have to do Kriya. Why? Rav Moshe says, yes, we have a Jewish state, and that's enough regarding everywhere in Israel. You don't have to do Kriya because we're not in Qurban anymore. But regarding Har HaBayit, as long as we don't have a Beit HaMikdash, it's still considered Qurban. On the other hand, the Mishnah Berurah does not differentiate. And as far as I know, and as far as I see, most people, when they come to the Kotel, do not do Kriya. And they're basing themselves on the Mishnah Berurah. Anyway, the point here, and this is point number 3, that the state of Israel is a third proof that we are in, quote unquote, Yemot HaMashiach. Yes, the Messiah is not here. By the way, when is the Mashiach going to come? Well, that's the continuation of the Shmona Esrei. We already saw that the first 2 stages of the Shmona Esrei is the 9th bracha, the land of Israel flourishing, and then the 10th bracha, mass aliyah to the land of Israel. The next stage we spoke about last time, Hashiva Shoftenu Kevarishona, reviving the Sanhedrin. Afterwards comes Vilu Yerushalayim Ircha, building the Beit HaMikdash. Afterwards comes Etzemach David Avdecha. The Mashiach is at the end of the process. And by the way, anybody who's learned Vayola Moshe of the Satmar Rebbe, he has a very difficult time explaining the fact that Chazal, and really all of us, daven the same Shmona Esrei, and agree that the Mashiach is at the end of the Messianic process. That Yemot HaMashiach is something that is a natural process, like the Rambam goes in depth. And again, first, we have to come and build the land of Israel. We have to make Aliyah. We have to bring the Sanhedrin. We have to build the Beit HaMikdash. And then Mashiach will come. By the way, it's important to stress, all of these stages of redemption are among the 613 mitzvot. In other words, you do not, and getting back to Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Reines, the fact that we are in the redemption is a nafkamina, as a practical ramification regarding doing Kriya, that you don't have to do Kriya. But regarding planting trees in the land of Israel, that was always a mitzvah. Regarding making aliyah to the land of Israel, that was always a mitzvah. Regarding setting up a Sanhedrin, that was always a mitzvah 1,000 years ago and today. Just like building the Beit HaMikdash was a mitzvah 1,000 years ago and is a mitzvah today. By the way, the definition of mitzvot is that they're eternal. So that we always should be trying to do all these mitzvot, but historically, the land is not going to flourish until it's time. The aliyah is going to be difficult until it's time. And when is the Sanhedrin going to succeed? Only in its time. So to summarize, and then we'll take questions or comments that we'll go over in the chat. Chazal tell us that, how do you know when it's not a false Messiah? 3 clearest signs. Sign number 1, when the land of Israel once again returns to flourish, right before Am Yisrael returns, Chazal tell us that's the clearest sign. Sign number 2, when you have a mass aliyah, and nobody can doubt that there has been a mass aliyah over the last century. Nobody can deny that it's from 4 corners of the earth. Nobody can deny that the graph clearly shows. Nobody can deny that we have passed the number 600,000. Today we've passed 6 million. And Chazal, if you believe in Chazal, they tell us that as soon as there are going to be 600,000 Jews in the land of Israel, there's not going to be another exile. Yes, we could have problems, but there's not going to be another exile. And point number 3, the Rambam tells us, and the Shulchan Aruch tells us, what is the difference between Churban and redemption? Jewish sovereignty. If we have a Jewish state, then we are in Geula. And again, none of the false messiahs did anything close to these 3. And yes, we are in historical times. And yes, if somebody is planning on Aliyah during Yemot HaMashiach, it's something that we should strongly consider. Okay.
All right, thank you. If I may, before we get to the chat, I'm going to play a little bit here, devil's advocate, if you don't mind. I hope you're right, but I don't, I'll just mention two or three sources, and, I really want to hear your opinion. The Rambam is very clear that we won't know what happens until it happens. Whatever he says, he then qualifies everything he said. It doesn't matter. We're not going to know anything until after the fact. We can never predict. Secondly, Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Reines, and if we want to take more modern examples, Norman Lamb, they knew all these sources too, and they were very, very wary of putting any messianic overtones. In other words, we just don't know. I believe me, I hope you're right, and I'm not. It's wonderful, all the things that have happened, but to assert with such finality that it's definitely the Gula, I think, is a very dangerous problem. And, Yaakov Avinu, God gave Yaakov Avinu a promise that he's going to protect him. And Yaakov Avinu says, God, if you protect me. And the rabbi said, what do you mean if he doesn't believe in God? Shema Yigrom Hachet. We never know. Even when God promises, we don't know for sure. And then I'll just, I don't mean to, I just want to throw it out if we're going to, and I guess you can comment on the article I've mentioned, I believe written in the 70s. I imagine you're familiar with the article in Tradition magazine about 40 years ago, written by, I don't remember the name. Really, I should have looked it up, and maybe I will look it up. A professor wrote an article, what would, God forbid, chas v'shalom, if the state of Israel would really be destroyed? It's written after the Yom Kippur War. What would happen? What would be the result? And he analyzed what would be the results. The Orthodox would institute a fast day, and this, and Reform Judaism would come to whatever. He had a whole analysis, and people went crazy. How dare the editors of Tradition allow such an article to be published in Tradition, the Journal of the Rabbinical Council of America? But they did allow it to be published, and I think today it's a little bit different. So I don't mean to, how would you answer the Rambam? Okay,
so
I'm sorry.
What I started out with saying is that the most logical and simple approach is simply to say, I hope so. And you don't need any proof to say that. But, and this is a very important point, when the Rambam says, Lo neda echi yeh ad sheyeh, where Rabbi Kelman pointed out that we don't know how the Geula is going to be until it is, that's exactly what we spoke about today. I did not know how we would fly back to the land of Israel until there were airplanes. I did not know how the Jews would come back from 102 different countries until I saw the first Aliyah, the second Aliyah, the third and the fourth and the fifth, and until we saw the Holocaust, until we saw all the things that we mentioned, we did not know. But now that we've seen them, the Rambam today, I honestly believe he would not say that it's rational to be an ostrich and to put your head in the sand and say, I don't see.
No, I don't.
We do see, again, what is the quote from the Rambam? It's really from Chazal. We won't know until we see it. But when we see it, we will know.
Except the Rambam defines, the Rambam makes a very clear definition of Yemot HaMashiach, and we're clearly not there. There won't be any Shibud Malchiot, and that, unfortunately, it's getting a lot worse than better. The last 25 years has seen a tremendous increase in Shibud Malchiot, the subjugation of nations. So the Rambam defines
the Shibud Malchiot that we saw in the Rambam, where the Rambam says, what is Shibud Malchiot throughout Chazal? It means to be subservient to a non-Jewish government. When we have a Jewish government, that's different. And the Shulchan Aruch that I cited, that's the halakhic proof.
No, when the Rambam says Ein bein olam hazeh limod Mashiach ala shibu malchut bavad, he's talking on a universal theme. He's not only talking on the Jewish people. He's talking about there'll be worldwide peace. When the Lubavitcher Rebbe in the 1990s thought the Gulf War would herald in the Yemot Mashiach, that's because democracy, the Iron Curtain had fallen, the Berlin Wall had fallen. There was tremendous hope in the 1990s. So we got Iraq out. So his idea, Lubavitch, not Lubavitch, the idea of Shiva Malchut is it's not only a Jewish ideal, it's a universal ideal. And that clearly we're nowhere near that, unfortunately. I listen, I agree. All this is wonderful.
I don't see that.
I don't want to sound like a
Safar Chassi. I do want to answer an important point that really needs to be addressed, because a lot of people ask, why did Rav Kook and Rav Herzog reveal that this is it. All right, if the whole idea of the threat of exile hanging over our head is to get us to be on our best behavior, so what do we gain by saying there's not going to be another exile? Now, the question is not on Rav Kook. The question is really on Chazal. When Chazal tell us, they give us these signs and tell us bi'ita, achishena, that there is going to be a deadline where there is going to be a redemption, even if we don't redeem it, even if we don't deserve it. The question is, why did Chazal tell us that? All right, the threat of exile is something which is good. And the answer is very, very important. Today in Jewish education, we don't punish with threats anymore. We punish, we educate, not through punishment, but to teach our students to love Judaism, to identify with the mitzvot, to identify with God, which is a much higher level. In other words, the threat of getting sent to exile doesn't work anymore. And not only that, I can't imagine anything worse than the Holocaust ever happening. And I don't think anybody can claim that it was a punishment. But if that didn't get Jews to do tshuva, nothing's going to get us to do tshuva except the exile itself, except the redemption itself. In other words, the threat of sending us to exile today is counterproductive. If you go to Tel Aviv and tell people, you know what, if you sin, God's going to send you to exile, they'll see that as a prize. I think most Jews in the world see living in America as a prize and don't see it as a punishment. And so the whole idea of a punishment really doesn't apply anymore. And in our generation, where we educate through love, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is setting the example by putting the idea of our king behind the idea of our father. That a loving father who wants us to return out of love, that is how we educate today. And when he's returning us to the land of Israel, even though we don't deserve it, for those three reasons. So even though the threat of exile doesn't exist, there are other threats. We could have wars, right? There still is reward and punishment. Nevertheless, the question of Vayayim Shamoa, if we don't do the mitzvot, is God going to exile us today? Rav Kook and Rav Herzog, and apparently Chazal, say no. That as soon as there is a bi'ita, as soon as there is a ketz, there's not going to be another exile.
Okay, I'm happy to continue afterwards, but to be fair, let's get to some of the questions in the chat box. But okay. Thank you, and I do want to thank you for the series and your wonderful presentation and everything. I don't, whatever. We'll continue our discussion later. But let's get through some of the chat box. If you, I'm happy to feed you the questions, or if you want to read them, you can read them yourself. Yeah, just read them a little bit out loud so people listening on tape later on can,
having a tradition and the tradition being correct are two different things. We have traditions in the Talmud regarding medical things, foods to eat to solve problems, which are incorrect. We have traditions regarding Rishonim and Achronim, which is proving inadequate. So now we have early Achronim and later Achronim. The Roman exile definition was changed to include exiles which are not Rome. We have traditions regarding bees and honey, which are also wrong. Could Israel be a Trojan horse? Gather most Jews, especially under 30, in one small place, makes us vulnerable. Remember the Gulf Wars? What if Saddam Hussein had a biological and other weapons? The Iranian threat still looms. Do we really think we know God's complete plans, including timelines, false starts and stops? The answer is the proofs, the main points were from the Nevi'im, from the prophets. And the role of the prophets is to teach us to recognize redemption. The Gemara in Masechet Shabbat tells us that one of the 6 questions that a person will be asked when he goes up to heaven is Tzipita li Yeshua. What is it, Sofeh? Anybody who knows a little Hebrew knows that Sofeh is a scout. The Boy Scouts are called the Tzofim. What is the job of a scout? So you have in the source sheet, we didn't have time to do it. Hashem tells Yechezkel, the job of a scout is to be a shomer, to look out, to see what's going on. And when he sees something that's going on, his job is to tell others about it. And Rashi there says that the idea is that when you see the signs of redemption from the Nevi'im and the Ran adds taking place in your day, it's our obligation to tell others. I'm very well familiar with the fact that most rabbis outside of the land of Israel don't teach these sources and don't learn these sources. And that's why I appreciated the invitation to be able to suggest another way of seeing Judaism, and to suggest that, by the way, I think, I don't know if it's 40% or 60%. I wouldn't be surprised if most of the Orthodox Jewish rabbis in the world see Medinat Yisrael as Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu, and that's why it's said in most shuls in the world. And but to learn why and where that comes, leaving Rav Soloveitchik to the side, because that's what I learn in America all the time. That's how I grew up. To learn another way of saying it, and that is the possibility that we actually are in Yemot HaMashiach.
As Rabbi Liebtag would say, Rabbi Liebtag says he hopes we're beyond Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu. That was 2 generations ago. That was the Reshit. Now we're beyond Reshit. But okay, there's an. I still prefer the Dr. Lamb way. By the way, I was just listening recently. You know, his Yortzeit recently. A few things they had, but we were talking when Dr. Lamb came to the Jewish Center. I think they didn't say, they did not say Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu. Oh, I'm sorry. When Ari Berman, the current president of Yeshiva University, who was also like Dr. Lamb, the rabbi at the Jewish Center before they became the president, I mean, he was living in Israel for a while in between. Norman Lamb did not like the phrase Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu. I believe either he said Shetehei Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu, a prayer, or he left it out. No, so it's very interesting.
That's not a chidush.
I understand it's not a chiddush, but I'm just saying. But it's very fascinating. What he said is that Dr. Ari Berman said that he didn't know what to do. He was like a young rabbi, and Dr. Lamb was still davening in the shul, and Dr. Lamb told him, "You're the rabbi. You do what you want." Like, in other words, I did it my way, you do it your way. And if I remember correctly. Anyways, but that's okay. But I hope Rabbi Liebtag's right, that we're beyond Reshit Tzmichat. We're in the middle. I wouldn't say we're Sof Tzmichat Gulatenu, we're be'emtza. Avinu Shemashraim Berechim V'Tinat Yisrael Emtzaut. I don't know how you would say it. Okay.
When in fact, the quotes that we saw of Rav Kook were 100 years ago. And Rav Tzvi Kook said 50 years ago, that's the source of Rav Liebtag. Today, we are waist high into redemption.
Yeah,
that was when there were 2 million Jews in Israel. Today, there are 7 million Jews. I would say we're chest high.
My arguments were on the certainty, not on the, I may believe it. I wouldn't express it in the certain terms, but okay.
Yeah, I understand.
But you're giving okay, go on.
Okay. They also teach about the Indus Valley, and a section of China of interest may be of Jared Diamond. Okay, I guess that's about the Fertile Crescent. By the logic of source 5, the increasing environmental damage in Israel has the effect of delaying the Geula. Very interesting. I never thought of that. And for sure, we should take care of God's world wherever it is, without a doubt. Israel was the crossroads of the world, right? Very important point. By the way, that's to understand the old world in Tanakh. Professor Yehuda Elitzur explains historically, based on the way the flower map that we mentioned, that there was always Egypt was the superpower in the south. In the north of the land of Israel, there was always a different superpower. Sometimes it was Ashur, sometimes Paras, sometimes Madai, sometimes Bavel. They were always fighting against each other. And each one of these superpowers wanted to conquer the other. And the only way Egypt could conquer the northern superpower would conquer the southern superpower is by passing through the land of Israel. Now, Shlomo HaMelech took advantage of this, and he told the Ashurians, if you want to buy horses and chariots from Egypt, for every horse and chariot that they sell you, you have to give me 2. And that is how Shlomo HaMelech built the tiny land of Israel into a superpower. And on the other hand, when you are at the crossroads of the world, and you are not strong, then it is the worst place to be. And that is one of the reasons historically why people did not succeed in developing the land of Israel. Okay, why they want the land. For Christians, super successionism. For Muslims, once a land has been a majority Muslim, Muslim still claims Andalusia, Spain, and Portugal, right? The old jihad. Would you be able to send us that chart? Yeah, I'll be happy to send it to
I can post it on the
Rabbi Cohen.
website even as part of the sources if that makes it easier.
Okay, non-halacha midrashim and or Talmud are non-binding as per Rambam. And again, that's why I said that our topic is midrashic, and that's why we brought sources from the midrashim. Our topic was nivuot, and that's why we brought proofs from the prophets. Nevertheless, the proof from the Shulchan Aruch is a halachic proof, and I hope today nobody will waste their clothing by start ripping it every time you visit a new place in Eretz Yisrael, because that's a waste of money. Because halachically, the Mishnah Berurah, by the way, it's not his chidush. He's basing himself on the Bach and the Beit Yosef, the Magen Avram. Really, everyone agrees that as soon as we have Jewish control over the land of Israel, we are no longer in Churban. And that is a halachic statement. I read today that there is a problem with allowing American Jews into Israel currently, problems by the Israeli government. I imagine that's connected with Corona or COVID. I hope as soon as possible. By the way, I have friends in America who decided during COVID to make Aliyah because they always took coming to Israel for granted until they couldn't. And, they have apartments here, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. I think it's a good opportunity also, by the way, to thank Prime Minister Netanyahu. I never voted for him. I'm not a just Bibi fan, but we have to give credit where credit is due, that he got the vaccinations where other countries in the world did not. And we have to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu and thank the Prime Minister for getting the work done. And it's just another example of how the state of Israel is not a banana republic anymore. We are on the map. Your three signs can be classified as necessary, but necessarily sufficient, but not necessarily sufficient conditions. Chazal don't word it that way. If you go again over the wording of Chazal, they're very clear that these are the signs. And when they say there is not going to be another exile once we return a third time. So that's the black and white question. Am I here or am I not? Are there 7 million Jews here or not? Wonderful series. Oh, Sharkoch, thank you. Somebody agrees. You answered questions, even difficult or opposing viewpoints, showing yourself to be a man of principle and good faith. Oh, thank you. Inspiring and so educational, learned a lot. Can't wait to go back to Israel. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing and greeting anybody who comes to Israel. The next step could still take 100 years. We don't know, correct? But everybody agrees that the pace of redemption, whether it's going to be slow or fast, depends on us and developing the land of Israel and making Aliyah to the land of Israel and setting up the Sanhedrin and doing tshuva and everything else that's entitled. That's what we should really be talking about. Jewish government could mean government according to Torah. That's why I brought the Maharal and the Malbim in sources 17 and 19. I believe we did them in the first shiur, that the Maharal talks about that the first government is going to be a Malchut Bilti Kedosha, a secular government, a non-holy government, out of which will grow the kingdom of Mashiach. And the Malbim in source 19 also says that the government, the first government, will start as a small democratic government, which will grow into the kingdom of Mashiach. So even if the government is not ideal as we would like it to be, at least the Maharal and the Malbim, based on the Navi Micha, say that yes, there is that possibility. By the way, most Jews in the world are not religious. According to the Pew survey, 93% of the Jews in America are not Orthodox. And if God wants Zionism and the return to Israel to be relevant to all of the Jews. Remember, the Geulah is not just for religious Jews. We want everybody, all Jews, to come from all four corners of the earth, which means that the state of Israel had to be relevant. And Rav Kook explains that if Zionism was a religious movement at the beginning, the rabbis would still be debating to this day whether we should wait for Messiah or bring Messiah. And thank God the secularists did not ask the rabbis. And again, the second point that Rav Kook mentions is that, yes, the state of Israel has to be relevant for everyone. And that's why, yeah, historically it had to be a secular movement. Rav Shvat, I was a student of yours a long time ago at Orot. I fondly remember your class and your Chug Shirah. Thank you for this series. Zahavi. Is that Zahavi from Switzerland? Definitely sounds familiar. Okay. Accepting $4 billion a year in aid from the U.S. can be defined as shibud malchiot. It undermines the independence of Israel. Very good question. Somebody always asks that question. I always wait for that. In a globalized world, America does not move without the Soviet Union and with Europe. China also depends on America. Europe depends on America and China. Everyone depends on everything. And according to that, there's no such thing as any independent state in the world. On the other hand, part of the redemption process, Rav Kook writes 100 years ago that the world is going to become globalized. And that's part of the process that we see and that we're learning about today. And that globalization is something very, very good. We in the state of Israel are as independent as anyone. We celebrate Hanukkah, which celebrates, the Rambam writes in Ilchot Hanukkah, that we celebrate the return of sovereignty for 200 years to the Jewish people. That sovereignty of 200 years, for most of the time, was under the thumb of the Roman Empire. Nevertheless, the Rambam calls that sovereignty. The Rambam says, yes, we should celebrate that sovereignty on Hanukkah. And accordingly, yes, we should celebrate a similar sovereignty on Yom Ha'atzmaut. The Jews of France are not making mass aliyah solely out of love, but also because of discrimination and anti-Semitism. Nachon, as a matter of fact, if you check, most of the 7 million Jews in Israel did not come out of a love of Zion. The first aliyah did. The socialist aliyah did. But most of them, unfortunately, were running away from Kishinev, running away from Hitler, running away from the Soviet Union, running away from the Sephardic countries. And that's davka, the zchut, that the people here, all of us from North America, we can fulfill the prophecy of Uval Tzion Birina, to come on Aliyah out of ideals, out of happiness, because we love the land of Israel, because it's a mitzvah, because we want to be with the nation of Israel, because we want to be part of Jewish history, because we want to be part of the Torah center of the world. And there's a lot of reasons to live in the land of Israel. You can find, I wrote 47 reasons. You can find them on the internet. I'm sure anybody here could sit down and come up with a lot of reasons, yes, to make Aliyah and to be part of the future of Am Yisrael, even if you don't believe that we're part of the Geulah. That's why I said before, all of these are mitzvot that are totally independent of the Geulah. Amazing series, thank you. I believe Rabbi Riskin and Chetei Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu based on the Rav. Yeah, that's what he said when I was in high school. I believe that when he came on Aliyah and Efrat, he accepted the nusach that everyone says. By the way, in general, there's a klal in Chazal, Kol ha'mishaneh yado ala tachtona. Whoever changes, whoever veers from the accepted opinion, he has the burden of proof. And I know that during the Oslo Accords and during different periods in Jewish history, different chazanim got up in different shuls in the world, and everybody added their own sentences and words and took out this and added that to the prayer for the welfare of the state of Israel. And in the end, at least the chief rabbinate in Israel, and I know of rabbis in America, who just said, let's keep it the way it was. And if everybody starts adding and subtracting, then that's how the Reform and the Conservative started shuls. That's how we have breakaway shuls. And Achdut, being together, being united, is definitely an ideal. Okay, while I very much see Israel as Reshit Tzmicha Gulatenu, having just returned from Israel this morning and having been there on Yom Yerushalayim, what transpired for 10 days, during those days, we were concerned about going to the Kotel. Again, nobody is naive to say that Yemot HaMashiach is completed. What this shiur proved is that we are in Yemot HaMashiach. From Marty, maybe the election of a prime minister who wears a kippah is part of the process. It's definitely part of the process. I hope it's for the good and not for the bad. We're very wary of what's going to happen now. I could definitely see how it could be very, very positive, because it's been a while since there has been unity. And post-Zionism has been setting into Tel Aviv more and more. And we want to keep all the leftists and all the secularists, we want to keep them in Israel. And one of the best ways to keep them in Israel is by having them feel that they are part of the government. Because for the last, basically since Oslo, it's been about 30 years since they've been part of the government. And I hope that is the good that will come out of this. But I am also very wary, and we must pray for the welfare of the state of Israel. Ruth says, thank you for inspiring and validating and energizing presentation, especially understanding that Yemot HaMashiach is a process that ends with a human Mashiach. Okay, thank you for your thank you. This is a wonderful series. Thank you. My pleasure. Nu, what will you be teaching next on Torah in Motion? That's up to Rabbi Kelman, but I must thank you all. I could tell from your eyes and from your questions and comments that it is a very intelligent group and a very mature group. I'm usually used to teaching more students around the age of 20, 21, and it really is a play. I teach in adult education in Israel as well, but teaching in English adult education is a unique, I'm forgetting my English. Now you know why I don't do it. How was my English? Was it okay? Was it
Your
passable?
English is very is. I wouldn't know you're Israeli necessarily. I mean, based on what you talk about, I would know. But your English, okay, you know.
I have one question.
Oh, and thank you. Hold on, just for I do want to. Somebody pointed out, just for the record, I want to correct myself. It was Rabbi J.J. Schechter, the story I told about what to say, Reshit Tzmicha Gulatenu or not. So it was Norman Lamb told J.J. Schechter, you switch it. Well, Ari Byrne, whatever. So I just want to, for the record, and I want to thank Ellen.
Does anybody know what they do today?
I assume they say Reshit Tzmicha Gulatenu. Yeah, my brother served as the first assistant rabbi at the Jewish Center under J.J. Schechter. I'm sure they say Reshit Tzmicha Gulatenu. But when Dr. Lamb was the rabbi, he Shetahei. And I was in YU when he was the president, and I remember him giving a whole talk about it, why, he doesn't like the phrase Reshit Tzmicha Gulatenu. Now, I realized that was a long time ago. Things change and perspectives change and all kinds of things, but I'm sure they say it. But anyways, thank you. I want to thank you very much for a very inspiring and interesting series. And whatever, we'll continue later, a little bit of our discussion. I know Zev wants to ask another question. Just before we do, I appreciate how many people have stayed online for these long questions. Normally we don't go so long, but I want to thank you. Yeah. So, people are obviously interested, and obviously anybody can leave. I don't, and listen later. I sort of apologize. I don't want you to feel you're missing anything. This evening, Mark Shapiro will be starting his appendix on his books. We're getting to the end, 8:30 this evening, and tomorrow, Rahel Sharansky Danziger begins an 8-part series, 11 a.m. tomorrow morning on Storytelling Kings. What's the official title? Storytelling and the Rise of Kings, basically on the Vim Rishonim, the whole transfer, how we do a Melucha. So that will begin tomorrow morning at 11. You do have to register, and please, so that. Okay, Zev, we'll let you have the final word. I know he wants to ask an oral question. He's got his hand up. Bakasha, Zev.
Do you have time for one question?
Yeah, I just have to apologize that also for drinking. I don't think it's very polite to drink during a class, but I've been on antibiotics with a strep throat for a week, and I was davening that I would make this year, and Baruch Hashem, we did.
It's absolutely fine to drink. It's
Sure.
hard. The throats. You need to. No problem.
Yeah, Zev.
Yeah, you said that the Chazal said that the first sign of Yemorisa Mashiach would be the land of Israel flourishing, followed by the second sign of the incoming of the Jews. But historically, hasn't it been the other way around? First, you have the incoming of the Jews, and that causes the flourishing of the land.
So the answer is, like the Rambam says, Lo neda איך יהיה עד שיהיה. If you would ask me 200 years ago, I would have said, that's a good question. How could you, like, where's the pasuk that I quoted from Yechezkel says that we will work the land. Haaretz te'abed. It's not that a magician is going to abracadabra, have a supernatural, miraculous flourishing of the land. Today, we know what happened. There was a small handful of about 18,000 Jews. I'm sorry, 10,000 Jews in the first Aliyah, who they dug for water. Baron Rothschild bought the land. After they sort of developed the economy, more Jews could come, and then more Jews, and then more and more and more. In other words, there were those handful who had to dig for water and develop the fruitfulness of the land. But it was just a handful. Kibbutz Galuyot really shifted into higher gear only after the land began to flourish. And since then, it's been flourishing. I once saw that the Israeli economy is listed as number 12 out of there are more than 200 states in the world. And the American economy is stronger than Israel, but you can't say that being number 12 is not flourishing. I guess the land is flourishing.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy, right? For Americans, right? I forgot now it's a holiday in America today, on Memorial Day. I guess you can call it a holiday. That's how people use it, but whatever. We should have times to celebrate. All freedom comes as a cost, as you were sort of alluding to. Gula is not easy. And that's why the opinion of, I believe, the opinion who wins when the Gemara said he doesn't want to be alive during Yemot HaMashiach because it'll be too uncomfortable. No, it was Hillel who said Ein Mashiach, not the famous Hillel, but a later Rabbi Hillel said Ein Mashiach Yisrael, but that's obviously not for this year or other year. But on his view, I guess, was not accepted in our tradition, but that was the view in the Gemara. But anyways, we should have Yemot HaMashiach in peace. That's to be the culmination. We should all live to see that the completion of the Gula, how far we are in the process, whatever, we should see that to a time of peace. And afterwards, we can debate when we see what happens, like the Rambam says. So then all the debates will end. However it happens is how it happens. And,
I hope you'll agree that there's nothing wrong with making Aliyah and trying to hasten the pace and to be part of the nation of Israel.
Yeah, okay. Listen, what can I say? I'm still living here. I haven't been zocha to make Aliyah yet, but it is the mitzvah of our time. We mentioned Rav Shechter in this famous article on Yishuv Yoretz. Every generation has a particular mitzvah that is more relevant to them, and obviously, I think we would all agree in this generation that mitzvah is making Aliyah. And I actually do know also a few people who've made Aliyah during Corona because it's the only way to get into Israel. People made Aliyah. That was I know someone who made Aliyah so they can go to a wedding of a relative, and that sort of was the impetus to have them make Aliyah so they could get into the country, go to the wedding, whatever. So God sometimes acts whatever. However God's acts, there's something we can learn from it. I don't know how God acts. That was my whole argument with you. I don't know how God acts. Okay, we should be well, and thank you very much. All the best. Okay, have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.